Please join me in saying this collect. O God of peace, you have taught us that in returning and rest we shall be saved. In quietness and in confidence shall be our strength. By the might of your Spirit, lift us, we pray, to your presence, where we may be still and know that you are God. Amen. You recognize that last little phrase, be still and know that you are God, from Psalm 46:10. If that's all you get out of Old Fashioned for the entire year, it will be enough. It's a wonderful phrase, a good thing to follow. So I want to start with the same review that you've heard before. We are going through Susan Elizabeth Oldfield's book, Fully Alive. The title has been taken from the 4th century Bishop Irenaeus' quote, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive," but it allows her to set up a framework for looking at faith and life that I find very, very helpful, but also aligned with how we talk about God and faith and life at the cathedral. This book then looks at the 7 deadly sins, which I'll talk about in just a moment. That's an Eastern Christian concept. It started off as the eight bad thoughts, became the 7 deadly sins in the medieval Western church, and we tend to think about it as these bad things we should avoid. Oldfield's frame lets us change our perspective, I think, and think about it more in terms of relationship. So for Oldfield, fully alive is defined as living a life rich in gratitude, humility, connection, and community. Gratitude, humility, connection, and community. It's hard to come to the cathedral for too long without hearing all of those words repeated in various different aspects. They really do undergird how we see a life in God. But part of the innovation that you can see from her frame is a redefining of sin. Sin in Oldfield's perception is not a moral failure, not a list of things you did wrong for which you must be punished, but instead everything that works against connection. Everything that works against connection. So, for example, when we say about Jesus, he was without sin, that's a capital S, the way it's said and printed. Do we mean he never took a bit of money off his mother's dresser without permission? Or do we mean he never allowed himself to be out of relationship with himself or with God or with other people? You see the difference? You may get to the stealing, but it's really about relationship, which is very, very important when you then come to talk about salvation. So Brother David Stendhal-Rast, known primarily for his writings about gratitude, comes and says he doesn't use obstacle to connection, he uses alienation, same idea though. But if you look at the bottom of this quote, he says the contemporary term for salvation is belonging. Now think about the difference between salvation as belonging and salvation as being forgiven for all the bad things you did so that you can go to a place that you want to go to, right? It's not that you can't get to the second perception from the first, but it's a very different way to live and think about God. So I think Oldfield is extremely helpful in giving us new words, if you will, a new kind of theological frame to look at what is traditional Anglican theology and spirituality. There's nothing new to Anglicans in anything that she says. But if you had the misfortune of not growing up in the Anglican Church, it may challenge some assumptions. And I want to do that gently, not because those assumptions weren't articulated by faithful people who were doing their best, but they're not the assumptions that we proceed on. And so I find that even with my children who were born and raised in the Episcopal Church, they are 3 generations Episcopalians, and yet they still got in their head this kind of sin management system view of religion. I don't know where it came from. It didn't come from church, but it got it in their heads. So when they came up for confirmation at age 13, I was not a priest at the time, and they're like, well, we don't want to do this. Well, I'm like, why? And they said, we don't believe all this stuff. And I said, well, that's why we're doing confirmation, but what is it you don't believe? And then they'd tell me, and I'd say, well, yeah, I don't believe that either, right? I don't believe that either. And then, of course, for many of us, we had this kind of awakening with the new atheists. Do you remember the new atheists, Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris? There was one more. There were 4 horsemen there. And, well, if you look at the God they're against, you don't believe in that God. Not in being true to the Anglican tradition. That's not God as we conceive God. It may be God as a fundamentalist Christian or a fundamentalist member of Islam or some other denomination or faith conceives of God, but not the way we conceive of God. So I think this is important to go back and kind of push the dirt off some of our assumptions and refocus on relationships so that we can get a sense of who is this God that we're here to worship and what are the assumptions we're making when we enter into relationship with each other. And when I say things like, I'd rather be in relationship than be right, what am I actually saying, right? So I think Oldfield is very, very valuable for this purpose. All right, I mentioned the roots of the structure of the book, which go back into Eastern Christianity. Evagrius of Pontus in the 4th century has 8 bad thoughts, and that leads ultimately in practice in the West as the 7 deadly sins. And then Oldfield has what I call the Oldfield 7. I'll give her credit for yet another iteration of these thoughts, which she's done by looking at them as obstacles to relationship. Now, she's not alone. Rowan Williams, a former Archbishop of Canterbury, came out with a book just after Oldfield that says basically the same thing, although in a very different way, a very highly theological and much more aesthetical way. You're welcome for not going through that book. But if you're interested in all this and enjoy reading more technical texts, Rowan Williams' book, Looking East in Winter, i.e., turning east when it's cold, turn toward the sun. Looking east in winter, which has a play on words, looking to the Eastern Church, while the Western Church is losing its faith. That's his double meaning of that title. It's an excellent book, and you'll find some deeper work done around what Oldfield is doing. So the Oldfield 7, we're on gluttony this morning. Gluttony from numbing to ecstasy. From numbing to ecstasy. With each of the 7 deadly sins, she's offered a revised definition, if you will, but I think more interestingly placed it on a spectrum of development. So again, it's not a moral failure we are to avoid in order to escape punishment. It's an impediment to the relationship through which, in which, and with which we will experience salvation. See the difference there? That difference pervades everything we're going to say. So if it doesn't make sense to you now, just keep asking that question, because hopefully you'll get it inside of you. And so when you look at things, you'll see it through those lenses and begin to reinterpret Scripture, for example, or our prayers, for example. And I think you'll find that they come to mean deeper and more relevant things when we can look at them through these lenses than they do if you simply believe that they are archaic references to some kind of hard fundamentalist faith which we no longer follow. We like church because it's fun and brings us together and we have experiences of God, but the Bible is kind of hard, right? Changing the lenses through which you read the Bible, I think, may help you find that the Bible is actually incredibly full of wisdom and psychological wisdom as well as any other kind of wisdom. They didn't make those divisions when many of those books were written. All right, gluttony. So let's start with gluttony. Oldfield's conceptual framework, we tend to think of gluttony much like this figure in this picture, right? Just too much of everything all the time. I want what I want when I want it, and thank God in my power and authority I can get it. And then she tells this very heartwarming story of a grandmother who kind of lived this life. That is to say, used food to calm herself and ultimately became almost immobile as her girth didn't let her get out of the chair. In telling this story, however, Oldfield makes a very, I think, valuable point. And that is she doesn't just look at her mother and judge her based on how heavy she is. She instead charts how she got that way. And some people have issues with pituitary glands or other things that cause them to be difficult to lose weight. I understand all of that. But in this case, there is this trauma in the family for 2 or 3 generations. And her grandmother's really heroic, or if you will, she-roic, effort to stand against that and protect the next generation from it. And it's almost like the obesity that she suffers is a consequence of this effort. Now, whether you believe all that or not, I mean, I do believe it, but I'm just saying what I find valuable about that is an awareness that I just want to put a pin in for you. And that is, if somebody bugs you, there's just something about them that's annoying. And you kind of can't let go of it. If you get to know them a little bit better, it might not bug you so much. You might learn something about why they're that way that turns out not to be a great tragic failure, but in fact a heroic effort to survive. Right? So I just want to, that's not what this lesson is about, but I think it's an area where it often comes up. If somebody is really bugging you, and for several of you there may be somebody like that, you may have been married to them at one point in time. I just want to make a plea that if you, why people call me in class, I just don't know. At any rate, I want to make a plea that part of being a community is getting to know people. And when you get to know people, you understand their very complex reasons for why they are the way they are. And as you develop some empathy and compassion for them, you may find that what bugged you doesn't bug you so much anymore. It doesn't mean you have to be great friends. It doesn't even mean you have to admire them necessarily, but it does mean that being human is complex. And we're all dealing with various levels of that complexity. I remember when my first child was born, we were so excited to be pregnant. And I remember going into the very first sonogram, and the nurse was ecstatic. She said, "Look at this." And she whipped that monitor around and she began with a pointer to point out various things that I guess I couldn't tell. And she just said, "This is great." And she ruled out 53,000 things that might have been wrong. She was so excited. I was horrified. I had no idea anything could be wrong, much less all this stuff. And I'm like, what else aren't you telling me? Right. My point is that is kind of a metaphor for a lot of life. The fact that we're here in some real ways is a miracle, not just because of the complexities of human birth, but the psychological difficulties of survival and the pain that we carry from prior generations, right? All right, end of sermon. What Oldfield does, though, is move from that and focus on redefining gluttony. So the gluttony becomes not overindulgence, but numbing and distraction, right? So remember, obstacles to relationship is her focus. So she's looking at what do we do to numb ourselves and distract ourselves from living life, from feeling our feelings or engaging those in front of us or doing what we need to do. How do we numb ourselves so that we become less fully alive by virtue of our behavior? Addictions are a dramatic example of all of this. Again, it's all complicated, but many of us do it from time to time regardless. It can be as simple as coming home and say, well, this was awful and I need a drink. Right? That's for many of us very common behavior, and I'm not trying to criminalize it. I'm just saying be aware, right? If you're doing that every day at dinner and then you're doing it at lunch, then maybe that's an issue, right? Not just because you're abusing alcohol, which is kind of interesting anyway. You don't really abuse the alcohol. But at any rate, it's because you are numbing yourself and stopping from engaging in life. Now, I'm not going to ask you to identify yourselves, but I know some of in this room observed dry January. I can tell by how sour your faces looked by January the 10th. I did dry January once, but I remember being at the Big Catch with my wife on February the 1st for lunch. And I ordered Sauvignon Blanc for lunch. And the server didn't know, so she brought it over and she kind of plopped the glass of wine in the middle of the table, kind of at the other end of this tall table we were at. And it might as well have been a banana split. I mean, I could smell the sugar all the way down the table, right? What's the difference? Stopping drinking, we don't eat sweets when we stop drinking because we can't afford all the new clothes we would need. But as a result, what happens to you? You taste your food differently. You smell things differently. You feel better because you're sleeping. You find out that you have all this time you didn't even know you had. You might even read a book that's been sitting on your table forever. And then, of course, February 1, you're ordering a glass of Sauvignon Blanc to get out all this healthy engaging of life that you've enjoyed. But it is, I think, a valuable practice like Lent, right, to become aware of the rhythm of your life. Not to stop all the stuff you shouldn't be doing, but to become aware of the rhythm of life and what are the obstacles to being fully alive. If we're utilizing Lent properly, that's what we're doing. When we're giving up things for Lent, it's not just because they're bad and we have to suffer somehow, like I'd wear a hair shirt, but they don't make them anymore. It's not that. It's take something you're dedicating energy to and then repurpose that energy to something that's more obviously of God and see what happens. That's what your Lenten discipline's about. Well, I hope that you can see in all these, pedestrian examples and commonplace examples that Oldfield's perception of relationship works. In each case, these are potential obstacles to relationships. By giving them up, which is the whole purpose behind fasting, which we don't really do much anymore, but it used to be a common practice. Of giving all that up means you have energy back, and what do you do with that energy? Just so you're more self-aware. All right. So Oldfield spends some time talking about escaping the full experiences of her life and all of the ways that she's tried to personally stop doing that. So that's where we're starting, this awareness that gluttony is numbing or distracting from real life. Now, if you haven't read The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis, you should. It's not C.C. Lewis, it's C.S. Lewis. But he says this. C.C. Lewis sounds like some kind of rock star to anybody. But Clyde says this. It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. Right? I love this flipping of the script, if you will. It's not that our desires are too much, and we have to calm them down. We have to dampen them. We have to inhibit them. We have to deny them. No, our faith is saying that they are too weak. God is offering us a joyful life. We are offering each other a joyful life, and our task is to have the courage to take up the mantle and live into it. And it's a little bit dated, but I still think the whole idea of mud pies is not a bad image. Like, it could be different than this. So one of the reasons people go on retreat, for example, just, again, playing on the dry of January or the Lenten disciplines, to go on retreat is to enter into a new rhythm, a rhythm of prayer, silence, solitude, and see what happens, right? Not, I'm trying to make this happen. I'm going to have an ecstatic experience. Jesus is going to appear at 10 o'clock tonight. It's not that. I'm going to change the rhythm of my life. I'm going to be still. I'm which means I've got to face myself. I'm going to enter into solitude, which means I've got to be challenged by that part of myself I don't pay attention to usually. And I'm going to pray, which means I'm going to reestablish my relationship with God. And what's going to happen? You can't imagine it. That's why you can't plan for it. But it will. So going on retreat or going on pilgrimage, those are all ways that we try to open ourselves, increase our capacity for God. And that's what C.S. Lewis is saying. So in that vein, Oldfield kind of picks up on Lewis's theme of not, it's not pretending we don't have desires. It's really redirecting our desires. It's redirecting our desires. And she says, there is an answer. Go to church. This is why we're reading the book. Right? Why go to church? Why does church help with any of this? I had the privilege of preaching at Lauren Holder's installation service up in Severna Park, Maryland. Many of you know and love Lauren. She is a rector of this church up in Maryland, outside of Annapolis. And we were using the lessons for the Martin Luther King Day. And so my charge, if you will, as the preacher, is to use Martin Luther King's example and have something to say to the church as they begin thinking about their new chapter. That's what I think you're doing. So when I looked at Martin Luther King's idea of beloved community, and in particular, the really dramatic examples of King forcing people to go through spiritual training before they could march. You with me? Not tactical training, spiritual training before they could march. I've told you this story before about Will Willimon, the Methodist bishop, who went down to Selma and was all eager to get into the street and found himself in the basement of a church undergoing spiritual training he thought was both rudimentary and unnecessary. So he turned to his trainer and he said, when are we going to stop with this stuff and get to the real work? And his trainer looked at him and said, when they unleash the dogs on you, when they turn the hoses on you, you're going to need to know who you are and whose you are. And that changed Willimon forever, but also what he thought he was doing on the street. So in looking at King's idea of the beloved community and his refusal to exclude anybody from it, I came up with 3 things that I thought were important. This is just an example of how preaching is really about you. One was to elevate equality. It was a radical belief in the dignity of every single person involved. Elevate equality. The second was value vulnerability. You don't get to be a community, you can't make the impression on the streets, much less in a church, if you don't learn how to be vulnerable with each other. Because vulnerability is a necessary precondition to intimacy, and intimacy is the catalyst for relationship. Right? So that's what we're doing in Bible studies and small groups and calling each other in pastoral care. Those are all moments when we're vulnerable. I just remember watching mom and dad as they grew older and increasingly found themselves in hospital rooms in increasing states of that they would never have let anybody see them in. How they'd let my father's a priest, so they'd let other priests in, but nobody else. Right? So there's somebody that you trust for it not to matter. Or how many of you have had somebody say, I'm willing to tell you this because I know you won't judge me. Like I desperately need to tell somebody this, but I'm so afraid of being judged, I need you, not because you have some therapeutic expertise, not because you know something about God, I need you to tell me, not because you even have any good advice, because I need to talk about what's happening without being judged. What are we bringing to the table? Just love, that's all. Love. In the spiritual direction world, we call that holding space for God. We're unlike other counselors, we're not giving advice. We're just holding space for God. And you'll just have to trust me. There's something at the dark times in your life about having another person there who clearly cares for you, who is also breathing and not judging you, is therapeutic and helpful and healthy. And that's what we do with each other in church. So value vulnerability. We spend a lot of our lives trying to distance ourselves from it, deny it's going on, and in fact, it's the key to salvation, I think, which you know by now is belonging, right? If salvation is belonging, then what's the key? Getting back into relationship with yourself, with God, with others. The third thing I said was rely on ritual. It's very important when you're preaching to use alliteration. I'm just telling you. So, elevate equality, value vulnerability, rely on ritual. We, in our modern West, don't really rely on a lot of cultural rituals anymore. Football games, but when my son years ago was living in Spain, after college he went and taught in a little hill town outside of Sevilla, and it was like every Christian holiday had some massive thing. I don't know that any of his friends believed in God or cared about the church, but they were going to the thing. He's like, Dad, I was in Sevilla at some square on Good Friday, and I couldn't even move. I mean, I got picked up by the crowd. It was because it's a cultural ritual which brings people together, has them breathing together, singing together, dancing together, moving together, and that has the consequence of generating community and relationship. Do you remember back, and some of you were old enough to remember when we thought Japanese manufacturing was going to take over the world? And do you remember, I mean, that's why I have cubicles everywhere, because the Japanese had cubicles everywhere. There's a small thing about taxes, but they went out, they'd have a manufacturing facility, they'd go out and do calisthenics in the morning. So you'd have pictures of all these folks in front of some Japanese manufacturing facility doing jumping jacks. Why? Was physical fitness important? I don't think so. I think breathing together was important. I think moving together was important. I think without words, they formed a sense of relationship and team that was important, and that allowed them to work more effectively. And the Japanese knew that, right? So when you come to church and you're singing and breathing and standing and kneeling, all the things we laughingly call Episcopal calisthenics, we've saved you from multiple books, you're welcome. But those are all, they're all liturgical elements that actually have meaning. They create meaning when we do it together. And then beauty. You know, we are so blessed here to have a music ministry that's so absolutely wonderful. Our sermons are good. We have good preachers, but that offering anthem, I mean, every Sunday, right? When they finish, you could hear a pin drop in the nave. It's beautiful. And our space is gorgeous. And while I've got our chapel up here, that's an effort at beauty too, right? We're designing the whole thing to create a new opportunity for silence and solitude and prayer, which is not readily apparent to everybody. Even my peers, I'll talk to my peers and they say, well, it's a mid-sized space. I mean, exactly how many weddings do you have? Have you done a revenue projection for how this is going to pay for itself? You're like, well, yes, but like that's not the point. The point is that prayer is part of our life. Silence is part of our life. Solitude is part of our life, and we can't be church without it. And we've lost that in most of our campus. Not because we don't value it, but because delightfully we're so busy. So we got stuff going on here all the time. If you want to go pray in the nave almost any time during the day, you've got to be a prayer warrior, because there's somebody playing on the organ and some tour that's going through, and they're probably trying to vacuum and clean up. And maybe they're moving things around because somebody's coming to have a concert. There's no place here for silence, solitude, and prayer until we get this chapel built. But that's why we're doing it. And it'll be beautiful, and we'll control the environment, all those things. But we're doing it because being church means gathering together and honoring these spiritual practices: silence, solitude, and prayer. So when Oldfield says, and she really doesn't frame it as a kind of normative proclamation, she frames it as a personal experience. Like she goes through all of her own struggles with various forms of what she would call gluttony. She's like, I find salvation from that in church. And she describes herself as a charismatic. So when she says church, it has a little bit more energy to it than what we're used to. But nevertheless, the fundamental elements are the same, right? How do we gather together and experience transcendence? So this is the key word, experience transcendence, which some people may kind of visually think of, if you're into spatial metaphors, as being above. I'm getting out of myself. I'm getting higher than myself. Others of us, particularly those in the contemplative tradition, will experience it as being deeper into ourselves. Transcendence is something where I'm deeper into myself, where I will ultimately experience God. Or it can be both. The point is, it's not you. So if you think about moments you've had in nature, if you hike or fish or ski or anything that you've done, there's undoubtedly been some moment when you were simply transfixed by the beauty of wherever you were. It could be the pine woods of Georgia. It could be the ski slopes of Utah. Nature invariably offers us these opportunities to forget who we are in the moment, right? I've told you before about being fishing out in Montana, and I was sitting on a stream just watching it, which is an important part of the story, actually, because I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So I'm already in silence and solitude, right? And this kingfisher flies right down the stream, the middle of the stream, and like everything just stopped. And it was essentially my version of what Thomas Merton describes on 4th and Walnut in Louisville, Kentucky, when he says, out of nowhere, I just loved everybody. You know, you just have this sense of being drawn out of yourself. And then it ended. Take a guess why it ended. Because I thought about me. Like, isn't this great? Boom, gone. Not because I'm defective, because that's how it works. Right? That's how it works. So church is an opportunity to be together with each other, and through our service and our worship and our fellowship to lose ourselves, to forget about ourselves, to get out of ourselves, and in doing so to expand our capacity for God, which makes us more fully alive. So that's kind of what we're doing in church, simply stated. So let me pause there and summarize quickly and then give you a chance to ask questions. Oldfield, who's focused on relationships, sin, obstacle to relationships, salvation, belonging. Through those lenses is looking at gluttony, redefining it as those things that numb us or distract us from being fully alive, and then putting that fundamentally on a spectrum between numbing and ecstasy. Both are attempts to take us out of ourselves, aren't they? Numbing, so I never get to myself. Ecstasy, so I get beyond myself. Right? So ecstasy then, if you go back to C.S. Lewis, is having the courage to fully engage life. Feel our feelings, experience our experiences, have confidence that God is there, whether it's painful or pleasurable. It's life. And we start that really with gratitude. That's my summary. Any questions about any of this? Or challenges? It doesn't. Right. So if I can paraphrase, and you just raise your hand if I'm getting it wrong, but to the extent we see in the West religion declining, certainly the traditional religions, it seems like that's a function of not really believing that God's going to do what we want God to do. So so yes, though I would say that, so I don't mean this to be a pushing back on you, I just want to play with the words for a minute. God is not going to do what we want God to do. It's not going to, right? Because what we want is what we can imagine, which we think will be pleasurable and good for us. And God's vision is going to be something different. So part of, I think, our challenge is exactly what you said, like we have to have the courage to believe that we're going to be better off in that other world. Because if we just want to be in a place where God's going to do what God's going to do, it looks more like magic and less like faith. It really exalts control and power and domination and not self-service and self-giving. Does that make sense? So yes, I think you're right. I think the church has become secularized. You've heard me say this before. But I think that's a gift to the extent that we're still here and we still have plenty of chance to change all of that. And one thing is clear to me, people may not be going to traditional churches, but they are not losing their yearning for spirituality or God. They're just not. You've heard me say before that I think part of what our challenge in politics today is a lot of that spiritual yearning has simply moved over to politics. So people feel about their candidates and parties the way they used to feel about their church, which makes compromise more difficult, or even kind of a loyalty, if you will, to the larger system and not your tribe is increasingly difficult to find. To me, that's just a kind of misplacing of desire. But as you hear me saying, I feel good about that to the extent that I don't think people are less religious. I just think we lost them for a moment. So I think we will have a spiritual awakening. I'm absolutely confident of this. How the Episcopal Church is going to play into that is open to question. You know me well enough to know that I think solitude and prayer are the answer. That we have this wonderful gift in the Anglican tradition of how to be community, which the world desperately needs. And so it's really important that we get it right and are committed to it. So thank you. That's a very good point. But I'm optimistic about it. I'm not pessimistic about numbers. I'm optimistic about our faith allowing us to be a model that's attractive to other people because they still yearn for that spiritual connection. The ecstasy that Elizabeth Oldfield is describing is still at the top of everybody from Maslow forward, still on top of the hierarchy of needs and desires. Other thoughts?
I agree with what you just, am I supposed to sing or what?
We want to catch the wisdom.
No. I agree with what you just said, and I think we have an opportunity here, having had my feet in two different places. I was educated by the Jesuits, amen, and here I am. But we have an opportunity here, and I would love to see us use the seasons of the church a little more, get deeper into Advent, get deeper into Lent, and bring community into that and show them, hey, this is what you can do for Advent. This is what you can do for Pentecost. I just think that the church has an opportunity to use these seasons to pull in community. I
like
see
that. Yeah, using seasons to pull in community, which is kind of like saying using all of our structure to generate faith, right, and to exercise faith. So in support of what you're saying, I'm interested, I mentioned before the whole new atheist movement. That was so traumatizing to me. I'm still recovering from it. Because here I was, this newly minted seminary student, and I couldn't answer their arguments. That was very embarrassing, and I don't like to be embarrassed. So it's interesting to see what's happened to that movement, because while they were good at destroying some things that maybe needed destroying, frankly, they didn't have anything to put in its place. And so a lot of the leaders, particularly that sub-tier of leaders below the Four Horsemen, are all out looking for some kind of spiritual fulfillment. Sam Harris is into all this Buddhist meditation, but a number have converted to Christianity, which is interesting. But to your point, what kind of Christianity do they convert to? The highest liturgy possible. It's like they're going to the big cathedrals in England where they're doing all the stuff. Why? I think because they appreciate that mystery is a deal, and that God is ultimately mysterious, so that we can't control it, we can't fully understand it, but we can encounter it, we can experience it. And so all of the things we do in our liturgy or with the seasons and our prayers that allow that kind of encounter is attractive. Yeah.
So one of the things I wonder about, like with our church, and sometimes I think there is a gap here, is that I think we are really, really good at the transcendence up, sort of getting outside of yourself this way, and just kind of kind of according to what you were talking about, like using the seasons, I thought maybe we need ways to help people make it more personal, like get their hearts involved. Not that they're not, but just, it's something about it becoming more personal rather than, I mean, yes, community, but like personal in community, and getting the going within as well as, going without that way. Because it's so easy to do at our church. It's so easy to get carried off into the, the stratosphere, I think, with the music and the liturgy, so.
Yeah, so to summarize, it's kind of helpful for us then to think about how do we engage God in a more kind of contemplative spirituality, perhaps, something that's more heart-oriented and less head-oriented. Thank you.
This is not a question, it's a plug.
So honesty is part of vulnerability. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I resonated so deeply with what you were saying, Oldfield's teachings about the solution. And on Wednesday in this room at 9:30, a colleague of mine and I will be speaking to this because surprisingly, and it's a talk about anxiety, a lowdown on anxiety from butterflies to panic attacks and how we can support the children in our lives. And so it's geared towards parents of pre-K to elementary age children, but really if you have a child in your life, if you're a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, or a neighbor, a friend of a child, this is for you. It's based on Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, and actually he is a self-proclaimed atheist and social scientist and has a chapter in the book titled Spiritual Elevation versus Spiritual Degradation, and what we can do as a society to kind of move against the effects of the great rewiring of childhood. So thank you for bringing this up.
Thank you for that offering.
Information's in the Cathedral Times.
There you go. And if you don't remember anything else other than somebody said something and you wish you remembered, just send me an email. Seriously, I love getting emails from you. It helps me know what you heard, and I'm happy to give you Teddy's contact information, her home cell phone number, but also the information about the gathering. So the reference to Jonathan Haidt, of course, we've studied Jonathan Haidt in here before, his prior book, and he's a secular Jew. He does claim to be an atheist, but Jonathan Haidt's one of those people that if I talk to, I want to say, atheist means against God, right? But I just want to say, what God don't you believe in? Because really, he's an Episcopalian, if you read his books, it's pretty clear. But I'm trying to give you not only a way to get through a cocktail party, but it's an exercise to remember that God, as we use that term, and we're not going to stop using that term, but it is so freighted, it is so weighed down with so many, in my view, misconceptions. But it may just be that I think they're misconceptions, somebody else thinks I'm wrong. The point is, they're really quite different. So when you're using the term God, often you're not talking about the same thing, even inside of our community. So I just want to highlight that. Sometimes it's good to explore what we mean when we talk about God. And I'll go one step further. I've got, my spiritual director won't use God. He uses you. So this is the heart stuff, right? So he'll use you, so it's personal and it's different, it's an other, but he won't use God because he grew up in an environment that no longer makes sense to him. So I just offer that as an example of how you can have conversations that matter, even if you're not using the language we always use. Other thoughts or questions? Yes.
I've really enjoyed listening to everybody. I'm kind of loud. I probably don't need it, but I'll do it anyway. I've really enjoyed listening to everybody's thoughts. There's been a few thoughts from that side of the room about it being more personal that resonated with me. There were other thoughts about the mud pies, and I absolutely love that book by C.S. Lewis. I think we're onto something really super important in here right now. And I don't mean to sound like almost desperate, anxious about this message. But the challenge, and I think the opportunity for the church to kind of be the anti-venom, is so powerful and so needed. Because I look at Oldfield's description of the 7 sins, and I love how she has it on a spectrum. It's all on a continuum of the state of our mind, state of our soul, so to speak. The problem we face is an outlet to the wrong end of the spectrum from every one of those is readily available. When I think about, and this is getting back to the message she was making about the anxious child, when I was a teenager, I couldn't go and find pornography whenever I wanted. I couldn't go and find food whenever I wanted it. There was, I think, just more scarcity across so many of those things. There's no scarcity on so many of those things. It plays to the frailty of the human condition so much. So as I come back around, it makes me think it's that much more important for us to examine the institution and say, how do we make these doors seem so wide open for the personal experience? How do we make it so wide open where it feels safe to come in and be vulnerable? Because I love when people talk about things like technology changing the inherent nature of human beings. Humans don't inherently change. The times might change, their surroundings might change, the things that allow them to indulge the worst of themselves may change, but people don't change. People might have left church, but they didn't stop yearning for spirituality, for something that made them feel small in a good sense of the word. I think it is really important we figure this out. I think society is desperate for those doors wide open place where it's safe to be personal and it's safe to be vulnerable.
Thank you. That's well said. We're all right, quickly, and then we're coming to the end of our time, but catch Neville over here. While you're wondering, I'll say that I think it's important that we figure it out too, but I want to underscore we, not the priests, not the lay staff, but we. We are at our best when we are operating as horizontal as we can and sharing our lives with each other, because that's what the body of Christ is. It's not complete unless all the parts are represented and functioning. Yes, sir.
So the remark about keeping the doors wide open, and the remark earlier about so many people having kind of a sin management approach to their religion made me think, as I was listening to this, and this material is super valuable, but I thought we're coming at it from the 7 deadly sins. And sure, we can recast that as, here's what it means to numb yourself, et cetera, but it's still something to avoid. Instead of, hey, be mindful, be present with God and his creation, it's don't be gluttonous. Instead of respect other people's property so we live in harmony and community, it's thou shalt not steal. Why is there such a tendency in the church and maybe life in general to cast things in terms of shalt nots instead of in terms of thou shalt?
Well, that's a great question. And so if you'll join us in 3 weeks, we'll come back to it. But I do think the answer to that question is rooted in our neurobiology, but I'll come back to it. And how do we, well, it's a great question. It has a lot of tentacles to it. So I'm sorry I can't answer it now, but yeah. All right. What? You need a real priest for that. All right. I invite you to stand and join me in saying this version of the Lord's Prayer. Let us pray. Dear Father, always be near us. May your name be treasured and loved. May your rule be completed in us. May your will be done here on earth in just the way it is done in heaven. Give us today the things we need today, and forgive us our sins and impositions on you as we are forgiving all who in any way offend us. Please don't put us through trials, but deliver us from everything bad, because you are the one in charge, and you have all the power, and the glory too is all yours forever, which is just the way we want it. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.